The trial is attracting significant public attention as Rob Reiner's son speaks out for the first time, giving direct testimony about what allegedly happened behind closed doors. The details presented in court not only raise new questions, but also leave Hollywood in a state of stunned silence, as the lines between family, reputation, and responsibility are being weighed against the scales of justice. This is seen as a pivotal moment that could completely change how the public views the case. If you want to follow the full developments, analyze every detail in depth, and not miss any important updates, please like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to stay with us on the hottest stories shaking Hollywood. Then, a striking comment from Billy Bush, considered one of the most astute entertainment reporters, added to the somber atmosphere. He mentioned Romy Reiner, then very young, as the first to discover her family's tragedy. New details emerging from this recording made an already grim story even more haunting. From the outside, everything seemed like a Hollywood fairy tale. But in an instant, it all spiraled into chaos. On the surface, the Reiner family seemed unshakable. Rob Reiner was a big name in the film industry. Michelle was always seen as a solid support system, and their children grew up in an environment of creativity, fame, and relentless pressure. Red carpets, camera lenses, applause, and perfect smiles were everywhere. But behind that glamour, many believed that silent tensions had been building for years, waiting to explode. And then December arrived. A fateful night brought everything to a standstill. Long-suppressed emotions erupted, turning a famous family into the center of a tragedy that rocked Hollywood. Nick Reiner became the accused, while his sister Romy hinted that the story had more hidden aspects than the public knew. It wasn't just a legal matter, but a labyrinth of loyalty, blame, family secrets, and the heavy shadow of legacy. Everything happened so quickly, without any sense of smoothness or clarity. Rob Reiner had dedicated his career to telling stories of family and connection, yet his own life took a dark and complicated turn. Nick had struggled in the public eye for a long time, and those close to him said the pressure never truly let go. There was a vague feeling of a storm brewing, though no one wanted to name it. Our investigators began revisiting Nick's past statements about his father. In this new context, those words took on a completely different meaning. In court, Nick's testimony surprised many, shifting the narrative and raising an unavoidable question. Had this tension been brewing for a long time? Things officially spiraled out of control on December 13, 2025, a day that should have been a time for family reunion. Rob and Michelle were at a Christmas party hosted by Conan O'Brien, a gathering of celebrities, filled with music, laughter, and flashing lights. Outwardly, the atmosphere was cheerful, but inwardly, something was amiss. Several witnesses later recounted a heated argument between Rob and Nick, loud enough to noticeably dampen the air. Anxious glances, brief exchanges, and a heavy feeling permeated the room. And some said Nick seemed absent, as if his mind were elsewhere. However, in court, Nick maintained he did nothing wrong that night. He claimed he was being blamed and even pointed the finger at Romy, saying she had messed things up and misled the public by publicly expressing her grief. Rumors spread quickly in the entertainment industry, and one comment was repeated. Nick was creating tension. Investigators began piecing together the events, tracing back to the final hours before the tragedy. Rob was described as unapologetic, confronting the situation directly and trying to reassure his son, while Michelle remained calm and steadfast. When they left the party, there was no commotion or chaos. Everything was quiet, as if the parents were trying to resolve a family matter privately. But witnesses said Nick's facial expression told a different story, a statement that reportedly stunned many and quickly spread throughout the community. That evening, Rob received a call from a close friend, mentioning Romy's role in notifying the authorities and the haunting final words the family had to face. The contrast between the laughter and jokes at the party earlier and the heartbreaking reality that followed created an indescribable shock, making the whole story even more heavy and unforgettable. Creative conversations continued, even discussing plans for the long-awaited sequel to Spinal Tap. Eric later recounted that Rob remained optimistic, focused, and completely unfazed. But just days before, in a rare private moment, Rob had admitted to a close friend that he sometimes didn't know how to connect with Nick anymore. And that statement, seemingly simple at the time, now carried a completely different weight. At the same time, Roy reportedly confided in someone close to him that Nick was blaming him for things he insisted he hadn't done. This suggests that these tensions didn't erupt overnight. They had been simmering for a long time, accumulating over time. And when Nick made his confession in court, those old cracks seemed to deepen, leaving no room for concealment. When the family returned to their Brentwood home early the next morning, a serious incident had occurred, shocking everyone who knew them. Authorities later confirmed the event took place before dawn, although the exact time frame was still being determined. The already tense family issues now became the focus of attention. By mid-afternoon, Romy, a neighbor, I decided to visit after being unable to contact her parents. Upon entering the house, she immediately sensed something was amiss. A heavy feeling pervaded the space. Minutes later, she called for help. Soon after, ambulance and police sirens blared, shattering the peaceful Brentwood neighborhood. Authorities arrived quickly. Inside the house, Rob and Michelle were found in critical condition, leaving those present stunned. The area was immediately sealed off for investigation. What particularly caught the authorities' attention was the lack of signs of forced entry. All the doors were locked, the windows were intact, and there were no signs of ransacking. This detail shifted the direction of the investigation, suggesting the incident likely involved someone familiar with the house. Neighbors were questioned, but no one had heard any suspicious noises during the night. There were no alarms, no cries for help, just an inexplicable silence. Investigators described the house as unusually quiet, so quiet that even the slightest sounds could echo. This silence, however, made them feel uneasy, as it lacked any sense of peace. Then another statement from Nick caused a stir. He claimed he wasn't there when it happened and implied that Romy was hiding something. Roy immediately refuted this, saying Nick was distorting the truth and deliberately shifting blame. As the investigation deepened, a common thread became clear. Anyone who had ever lived in that house knew every nook and cranny, every habit. Everything seemed controlled, not a random chaotic mess. A record showed Nick leaving Brentwood in the early morning and checking into a Santa Monica hotel shortly afterward. Hotel staff recalled him behaving calmly and politely, even inquiring about breakfast like a normal guest. There were no obvious signs of panic or distress. However, just hours after Nick left, the hotel room was searched, and a crucial discovery changed everything. The evidence gathered there was believed to be directly related to what had happened at the Reiner house. In court, Nick's testimony tied him to the timeline of that night, making it impossible for him to detach himself from the chain of events. From that moment on, Nick was no longer an obscure figure in the affair, but the center of attention. What puzzled many was the short time Nick spent at the hotel. He appeared, remained silent, and left before dawn, as if to avoid attention. A neighborhood acquaintance later recounted the rapidly spreading rumors, describing an unbelievable sequence of events, from the family being severely traumatized to Romy being the one who discovered him and called for help. These accounts were further elaborated by the information that, while everything was tense, Nick was seen at a gas station, behaving completely normally, buying water, paying, and leaving. The contrast between this outward calmness and the ongoing investigation sent shivers down the public's spine, making the story even more complex and unpredictable. Without any haste or sign of anxiety, Nick appeared with a calm, almost cold expression. His movements were slow and steady, just like any other ordinary morning. When reporters questioned him about what had happened earlier, Nick answered briefly, his voice decisive and emotionless. He asserted that he had nothing to hide, claiming he had done nothing wrong, and emphasized that Romy was the one who knew the truth. In a short time, this statement spread rapidly on social media, igniting a fierce controversy. Hours later, a close associate of Romy revealed that she had broken down in tears, saying that Nick continued to distort the truth and deliberately shift the blame onto her. That evening, police tracked Nick's movements near the exhibition park adjacent to the University of Southern California campus. For the investigators, it felt like a noose was closing in. Nevertheless, Nick maintained that it was all a greatly exaggerated misunderstanding. As the police cars pulled in, their flashing red and blue lights reflected off the deserted street. But there was no chase or chaos as many had imagined. Nick was cooperative, calmly following instructions and barely saying another word. He was quickly apprehended without any resistance. By the end of the night, detectives began piecing together the entire sequence of events. A tense family argument, an unusually quiet house, no signs of forced entry, and scattered movement tracks throughout Los Angeles. All the pieces gradually revealed that this was no simple or random occurrence. A persistent question hung over the investigators' minds. What really happened inside the Brentwood house before dawn? Once the scene was secured, forensic teams quickly moved in. They took photos, collected samples, and scoured every corner of the house, while at the command center, investigators gathered around maps and screens to reconstruct every minute of that fateful night. There were no surveillance cameras inside, no clear timeline data. All conclusions had to rely entirely on forensic science. Environmental temperature, physical traces, and even seemingly insignificant details became crucial clues. During questioning, Nick allegedly told the detectives they were wasting their time, continued to assert his innocence, and asked them to ask Romy for the truth. Immediately, through his lawyer, Romy strongly refuted this, claiming Nick was deliberately distorting the facts to protect himself. The two brothers, with their completely contradictory accounts and almost no common ground, further hampered the investigation. Forensic experts then focused on key indicators such as rigor mortis, tissue elasticity, and biological changes over time, factors that helped estimate when the events occurred. After careful analysis, the examiners concluded that Rob and Michelle most likely died in the early morning hours before they were discovered. This conclusion aligned with the investigators' initial suspicion that everything happened while the entire neighborhood was asleep. The injuries were described as occurring at very close range, suggesting direct confrontation between the parties involved. According to experts, this was not a spontaneous act. The evidence indicated a prolonged event, with repeated actions and accumulated tension over time. One forensic expert was quoted as saying that the perpetrator stayed until everything was over, a detail that sent chills down many people's spines. When this information reached Nick, and he immediately denied it, insisting he hadn't harmed his parents and claiming Roy was still there after he left. Nick's voice was described as trembling, a mixture of fear, anger, and defensiveness. However, Roy told close family friends that Nick was lying and knew exactly what had happened, asserting that he was present when everything fell apart. These two conflicting accounts continued to shroud the case in a thick fog, where the truth remained to be revealed. Even as emotions ran high in the interrogation room, the investigators maintained absolute focus. They did not allow emotional speculation to guide them. The chain of evidence gathered at this point, according to the authorities' assessment, showed a clear direction regarding motive and severity. Prosecutors argued that once the incident began, it did not stop halfway. After the entire report was completed, Nick Reiner was formally charged with 2 first-degree murder charges, each involving a parent, under California state law. This is the most severe prosecution bracket. The prosecution emphasized that they believed the alleged acts were premeditated and likely premeditated. The case was further escalated when special circumstances were added due to multiple victims, a move that is believed to have completely changed the course of events. Under the regulations, if convicted at this level, Nick could face life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office stated that the forensic findings met the necessary standards to proceed with prosecution that night. In court, Nick's initial statements were considered highly influential in shaping the course of the case. From this point on, the incident was no longer seen simply as a family tragedy, but as one of the most shocking legal battles the city had faced in years. Despite this, Nick maintained his stance. Standing beside his lawyer, he declared his innocence, denying all charges and claiming Roy had orchestrated his actions. A video recording of that statement quickly spread through news reports and social media. The investigative team immediately responded, asserting that those statements were inconsistent with the collected facts and suggesting Nick was fabricating a story to defend himself. Even prosecutors acknowledged that the dynamics and family structure in this case were unusual compared to previous precedents. With the timeline established, or the cause determined by the investigation file, and Nick's movements tracked across multiple areas of Los Angeles, the case file quickly became tightly constructed. When Nick first appeared before the judge, the atmosphere in the courtroom was almost frozen. Silence reigned, the tension so intense that even his simple gray attire became the focus of attention. In mid-December 2025, Nick was escorted into the Los Angeles courtroom under tight security. Up until that point, many details existed only in internal reports. After the first appearance, everything gradually became public according to the proper legal procedures. There were no television cameras, no live broadcasts, no press photos. The court applied strict restrictions, tightly controlling the courtroom. A small group of people were present when the doors opened. Witnessing Nick enter, escorted by 2 deputy sheriffs, and sit down at the defense table. Footsteps echoed clearly in the silent space. A reporter later recounted that Nick quietly said he didn't do what he was accused of. Just minutes later, social media exploded with conflicting opinions. As the judge read the charges, Nick stood still, his hands clasped. When asked about his defense, he unequivocally stated his innocence, affirming his love for his parents and emphasizing that he would never harm them. He went on to say that Roy knew the truth. However, what caught many people's attention wasn't just his words, but also the padded protective jacket Nick was wearing, pale, thick, and hard to ignore. Some legal experts argue that information related to statements made outside of court, if considered to have special legal value, can still be considered according to due process, even if they are not presented directly in court. That image quickly became etched in the public memory, marking the moment the case transcended the boundaries of a family story to become something darker and more complex. No one spoke in the courtroom, not the judge, not the lawyers, not the clerk. The hearing proceeded as if the protective cloak didn't exist. When the formal proceedings began, the room was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the rustling of paper and the monotonous, cold reading of the indictment. 2 charges of first-degree murder were stated, each linked to a different victim. No commentary, no emotion displayed, only the legal process being executed. When the judge asked Nick if he understood his rights, he calmly confirmed. That was his only word in the session. No further explanation, no reaction, no glance around. Nick sat upright, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if bracing himself for a major shock awaiting him. Those present in the courtroom said his face was almost expressionless. Strangely calm, yet possessing an indescribable numbness. His gaze fixed, his posture upright, as if detached from everything happening around him. But it was in that moment of silence that a small detail quickly captured attention. A nearby reporter overheard Nick whisper, almost a breath escaping through the gap between his lips. "I'm innocent. Roy knows that." That faint sound could have faded into the void, but once recorded it spread like wildfire, becoming the focus of discussion within minutes. After the formal charges were announced, the court's attention shifted to procedural matters. Nick's lawyer requested more time before presenting his formal defense, citing the need to review new evidence and additional testimony. The judge granted the request and decided to postpone the preliminary hearing to early January 2026. The prosecution did not object. There was no argument, no heated reaction. The entire room was shrouded in an atmosphere so heavy it was almost palpable. No one raised their voice, there were no dramatic moments, only a thick silence that enveloped everything. Beneath that outward calm, tension simmered, like an undercurrent constantly fluctuating. When the hearing concluded, one thing became clear to all who witnessed it. This was not the end. This was only the beginning of a long and fierce legal battle. Nick's whisper, however brief, "I had opened up a new layer of suspicion." And then everyone's attention shifted to the man standing beside him. The defense attorney was not an unfamiliar face. It was Alan Jackson. The moment the name was mentioned, the atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to change instantly. Jackson was famous for his involvement in some of the most controversial cases, having faced prosecutors in intense and protracted legal battles. His client list was tied to a series of scandals that had shaken public opinion. Nick's choice of Alan Jackson was seen as a silent declaration. This wasn't a weak defensive effort or a temporary solution. It was a sign of a full-scale counter-strategy, a readiness to go all the way. Reporters outside immediately started buzzing, and one person in the legal community whispered that he was the kind of lawyer only hired when you're fighting for everything. That assessment quickly spread. A source close to the family said Roy was truly stunned by the legal team Nick had assembled. According to her account, she believed her brother was trying to project an image of innocence by making a big fuss, because he understood he had been cornered with no way out. From that moment, the tension was no longer concealed. When the hearing ended, Nick left the courtroom just as he had entered, silently, solemnly, escorted by police. He didn't look at the press, didn't respond to the shouted questions, and there were no statements from either side. Just minutes later, the courtroom was empty, but the repercussions remained. Rumors began circulating that Romy Reiner was likely to testify, and that she had recounted her mother's final words, directly alluding to Nick. This information immediately sparked a new wave of debate. By that afternoon, public attention shifted to another equally shocking question: who would pay for Nick Reiner's high-profile defense team? Rumors spread quickly, as everyone understood that a case with two such serious charges could drag on for years. The costs for lawyers, experts, expert opinions, and related procedures could skyrocket uncontrollably. Many in the industry estimated that this figure could easily exceed $1 million, or even higher. The situation became complicated when considering Nick's financial situation. He had no recent acting projects, no publicly available income large enough to explain such enormous expenses. The gap between his financial reality and his renowned legal team caused social media to explode with speculation. Some suggested that family inheritance money was being used. Others questioned whether it was legal. Inheritance law experts quickly spoke out, calling it a risky gray area. One legal analyst bluntly stated that if Nick was using family assets, Roy could absolutely object to every single expenditure. That statement only added fuel to the fire. According to close sources, Roy was furious and believed her brother was using money that didn't belong to him. She reportedly said their father would never accept that. Nick's lawyers immediately countered, asserting that all expenses were legal, transparent, and fully documented, and accusing Roy of continuing to distort the truth. Public opinion was clearly divided. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, not a word was spoken about the financial matters. No questions, no petitions, just silence in accordance with the law. In contrast, outside the court, a chaotic atmosphere prevailed. The media was constantly present as information emerged, suggesting that some family members desired sympathy rather than punishment, and began bringing mental health issues into discussion alongside the serious accusations. The divisions within the family became increasingly apparent, reflecting the complexity of the case. This is no longer simply a legal story. It has become a question of loyalty, responsibility, and how each person defines justice within a family pushed to the brink of collapse. However, up to that point, no official statements had been confirmed. No public records, no published documents, only hearsay from sources supposedly close to the prosecution. Their position remained unchanged, as Nick's statements in court continued to be the focus of attention. Prosecutors insisted that they had complete faith in the forensic evidence, in the reconstructed timeline, and in Nick's movements throughout the city that night. In their view, the pieces fit together perfectly. They argued that the actions clearly showed intent, not randomness or impulsiveness, and with two victims in the same incident, considered a special circumstance, the legal consequences, if convicted, would be at their most severe. There was no indication of a possible settlement or reduction of sentence. Only the most serious consequences allowed by law remained. So outside the courtroom, the wave of public opinion continued to rise. New, unverified information constantly appeared in the newspapers. Meanwhile, the investigators remained completely silent, further fueling rumors about sealed evidence. Roy reportedly told a close friend that she only wanted the truth to be revealed, whatever the cost. Nick, through his lawyer, quickly responded, reiterating his innocence and claiming Roy was avoiding core questions. At this point, the confrontation was no longer simply a criminal case. It had become a battle for control of the narrative, for family loyalty, and for who would win public trust. Inside the courtroom, the surface remained quiet, but beneath the surface, the pressure was growing, something almost everyone could feel. And then one thing gradually became clear. Nick Reiner chose not to remain silent. A few days later, attention unexpectedly returned to an old statement of his, previously overlooked, but now carrying a completely different weight. Those words were seen as potentially shaking up perceptions of the case and reshaping the strategies of both sides in court. Nick had shared about his childhood, admitting that he never truly felt connected to his father. He said there was always an unnameable distance between them, a lingering emptiness. "I loved my father," he once said, "but I always felt like an outsider." That confession surprised many, especially when compared to Rob Reiner's long-held public image, that of a devoted, respected father deeply involved in family life. From the outside, the Reiner family seemed to embody what one might call ideal: family dinners, shared interests, strong bonds, or at least that was the image. But for Nick, the experience was different. He described himself as often being in the role of an observer, physically present but emotionally distant. Those close to the family later suggested that Rob had done his best, never intentionally distancing himself from his son. However, a busy career and a stressful life may have created voids that Nick could never fill. That family, though seemingly perfect in the public eye, was far more complex behind closed doors. Nick once expressed his feelings in a way that stunned many. He said he was surrounded by love, but couldn't feel it, as if an invisible barrier prevented everything from reaching him. That feeling didn't come overnight. Nay, it accumulated slowly over the years, until loneliness became a familiar part of him. Friends described Nick as quiet, introverted, a deep thinker, always seeking validation but rarely feeling fulfilled. He wasn't the boisterous or impulsive type. On the contrary, he was discreet, observant, and carried psychological burdens that initially went unnoticed. This emotional context led many to view the incident through a different lens. Suddenly, Nick was seen not only as a suspect in a family tragedy, but also as a man torn apart by years of silent pressure. This raised questions about the true extent of the emotional distance within the Reiner family. The line between a personal tragedy and a deeper story of psychological trauma blurred. According to later accounts, as feelings of isolation increased, Nick began to feel unsafe in his familiar environment. What had once been a source of support gradually transformed into pressure, expectations, and a constant feeling of being scrutinized. He began searching for a sense of belonging elsewhere. Initially, these were small, seemingly harmless choices, but gradually they ensnared him. By his mid-teens, things started to spiral out of control. Nick entered rehab for the first time at a very young age. Reiner's family didn't hide it. They intervened early, sought professional help, and did everything they could to prevent things from spiraling out of control. It wasn't a family secret. It was a public and painful struggle. Treatment program after program, specialist after specialist, each time with the hope that this time things would be different. Nick later admitted that the addictive substances were more dangerous than he thought. He had said he thought he was still in control, but the reality was the opposite. That realization came as a blow. Then came a vicious cycle, brief periods of improvement, interspersed with severe relapses, leaving behind not only disappointment, but also ever-deepening cracks in an already fragile family relationship. They thought that after each recovery, things would gradually get better, but reality was far more cruel. Each relapse was more severe than the last, draining the strength and spirit of everyone involved. Nick was constantly on the move, from one place to another. New Jersey to Texas, with no end in sight, no sense of stability. These weren't journeys of discovery or escape. They were journeys of survival, filled with anxiety, loneliness, and an exhaustion. Yet, throughout that time, Rob and Michelle never turned their backs on him. Not even once. They were always there, calling, seeking support, contacting professionals, and continuing to pay for treatment time and time again. Close friends remember Rob saying that if they stopped trying, Nick would lose faith that he could change. That very belief became the driving force that kept them going. In their rare public conversations, Rob and Michelle never blamed circumstances or anyone else. They didn't hide the truth, nor did they try to downplay the reality of the situation. Everything they did stemmed from a desire to help Nick, both emotionally and materially. For them, it was never about image or fame. It was a story of love and unwavering perseverance. Those close to the family say that their efforts never stopped. Even in times when hope seemed lost, turning their backs was never an option for them. Then Rob decided to try a different, bolder, and riskier path. He invited Nick into his creative world, working together on a film project directly inspired by Nick's experiences. The film is not easy to watch. It doesn't conceal the truth, doesn't sugarcoat the pain, and doesn't offer a fairy tale ending. Everything was laid bare. Relapses, resistance, feelings of helplessness, and the relentless struggle to start over. During the course of the project, something changed. Nick showed up on time, focused, serious, and worked closely with his father. That framework and discipline gave him a sense of security he had lost long ago. A member of the film crew once remarked that you could clearly see the pride in Nick's eyes. For the first time in years, hope was no longer a vague concept. Rob and Michelle believed that things were finally moving in the right direction. The energy around Nick changed noticeably. He was calmer, more focused, and more disciplined. Friends noticed Rob seemed somewhat relieved. He once shared with an acquaintance that the project had saved both father and son for a time. That shared creative space accomplished what years of therapy hadn't, but that balance was incredibly fragile. When the film was finished, Nick stumbled again. Old habits quickly returned, bringing with them the familiar chaos, even more intense than before. This failure deeply affected Nick and simultaneously eroded his parents' resilience. They tried to mend things, but the accumulated wounds were undeniable. Rob never stopped believing Nick could start over. However, and in the years immediately leading up to the breakdown, the family atmosphere grew increasingly tense. What had once seemed controllable now became unpredictable. The cycles repeated faster, more intensely, and more frighteningly. Even everyday moments were tinged with anxiety. Love remained, but fear quietly grew. Those close to them said the worry now went beyond simply recovery. It concerned boundaries, stability, and emotional security. Love alone was not enough to dispel the fear. And over time, that fear became a familiar part of the Reiner family's daily life. The emotional distance between Rob and Nick, something Nick had mentioned years before, not only didn't narrow but grew even deeper. It wasn't a story of blame, but of two people trapped in a painful spiral. Love intertwined with guilt, hope dragged down by disappointment. A family friend once said they never stopped loving Nick, but also had to admit a bitter truth. Love alone wasn't enough to solve everything. And as the holiday season approached, the family gathering took place in an atmosphere where the tension had been simmering for so long, accumulating over the years without ever truly disappearing. The argument didn't come suddenly. It was like the final breaking point after years of accumulated tension and silent emotional exhaustion. Each failed rehabilitation attempt, each late-night call, each tense conversation further eroded the already fragile bond between family members. According to those familiar with the situation, that night was simply when things could no longer be suppressed. Nick later claimed the events were misinterpreted, and he argued that Roy had reinterpreted the story to make him appear guilty and even claimed she had told others about it in a way that was unfavorable to him. Nick went on to claim his family exaggerated their fears about him, as if they were worried about what he might do. However, in court, Nick's testimony contradicted the descriptions of the others. The alienation he described as having existed since childhood, the disconnection, the feeling of not belonging, had never truly disappeared. It followed him into adulthood, influencing his relationships and important life decisions. When he said, "I'm okay," he was never truly okay. Even when things seemed calmer on the surface, the void remained, dragging him and those around him back into the old cycle. After the deaths of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner, the public held its breath awaiting a response from the family. And when they finally spoke, it was a shocking moment. The first official statement, issued jointly by Roy Reiner and Jake Reiner, was not legal or speculative, but pure grief and undisguised love. They described the loss as unimaginable, a pain beyond the capacity of words. Without mentioning fame or career, they spoke of family. Rob and Michelle appear not as Hollywood icons, but as parents, as people who bring warmth and connection, even amidst the chaos of life. Hidden within that message is a clear desire: privacy. The family requested to be left alone during their mourning period, away from cameras, rumors, and public attention. Since then, there have been no further interviews, no further statements, and they chose silence to protect their fragile peace while the truth continues to unfold. Nevertheless, speculation continues to spread. Some sources claim Nick tried to contact them from detention, hoping to speak with his siblings. According to an anonymous source, Roy responded through his lawyer that the family needed space and that this was not the right time. This information spread quickly, though unconfirmed, only deepening the pain. This family is not just grieving. They were trying to weather a storm that had torn their world apart. Then they completely withdrew from the public eye, choosing to mourn in silence, as if to affirm that this chapter belonged to them alone, not to sensational headlines. A private memorial service was held, attended only by those truly close to them. No cameras, no media, no fanfare. Those present described it as a quiet yet deeply moving ceremony, a place of silence, laughter mixed with tears, and stories shared with genuine love. One friend said it wasn't a Hollywood farewell, but a family farewell. And that statement seemed to say it all. Meanwhile, across the entertainment industry, tributes poured in. Kathy Bates mentioned Rob's leadership, who always gave actors the space to be brave and put their faith first. Kate Hudson called him the creative father of so many who worked with him. Nick Robinson remembers Rob as a mentor who never belittled anyone, but quietly guided them with calmness and trust. Each voice has its own, but they share the same message. Rob Reiner uplifted so many people. Even audiences who never met him share how his films touched and shaped their lives. His works speak of connection, compassion, and the imperfect beauty of humanity. And as the tributes continue to resonate, one thing becomes clearer than ever. His legacy isn't measured by the number of awards or box office numbers. It lies in the people he touched, the people he believed in, and the stories that live on in their memories long after the screen closes. And while Rob Reiner's name is often mentioned, those close to the family always emphasize that Michelle Singer Reiner deserves to be honored as well. She chose to remain outside the spotlight, but it was her quiet presence that shaped everything. Friends say she was the calm anchor behind the creativity, the balance that kept the family stable when fame became noisy and harsh. Her influence wasn't ostentatious but profound. They speak of her compassion and of her dedication to making the world around her kinder and more tolerant. A close friend once said they not only built a family, but also cultivated a legacy of love together. Simple words, yet with lasting weight. And then the contrast became so stark, it was impossible to ignore. On one side, Hollywood looked back and celebrated Rob's influence. On the other, a family faced a harsh reality, a pain that transcended any red carpet moments or memorial tributes. While studios and fans reminisced with reverence, legal proceedings continued in the present. Grief and legacy intertwined, forcing the public to confront both simultaneously. Each time the truth seemed to draw closer, rumors emerged, obscuring everything. Some said new details were being quietly considered. Others hinted that a family member might have shared information with investigators that had never been publicly disclosed. Whatever the truth, it remained beyond public comprehension. The tributes, therefore, carried a bitter undertone. They remind us that behind every headline are real people, with real pain, not just familiar names. And to this day, one question remains unanswered. What really happened in the Brentwood house that night? Nick continues to maintain his innocence and claims Roy knows more than she admits. Meanwhile, Roy insists Nick is distorting the truth. Two opposing viewpoints, two parallel stories, and the gap in between remains unfilled. Now it's your turn. What do you believe? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to follow the next part, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We'll continue to follow what is said to have happened, what has been verified, and what might be revealed in the future. Hello, everyone! First of all, I want to express my sincere gratitude to all of you for visiting the channel. Your interest and support truly mean a lot to us, so don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to join us for more fascinating stories. Today, we'll be exploring a shocking story, the case of Nick Reiner. Many questions remain unanswered. What led to that ultimate moment? What led to him being accused of murdering his own parents, Rob and Michelle? The mysteries behind this act are not just a criminal case, but also reveal the dark sides of human psychology and details that send shivers down the public's spine. Let's delve into each detail, each development, to see the big picture and uncover the little-known truths behind this haunting story. That Nick Reiner, a name associated with heartbreaking and mysterious events, continues to leave many wondering what really happened. A key witness who shared a room with Nick at a high-end rehabilitation center in Malibu, California, when they were both 15 years old, has revealed a completely different perspective on Nick's personality and childhood. He recalls the early days at the center, when Nick appeared as a cheerful, humorous boy, always bringing laughter to those around him. But as he stayed longer, the instability in Nick's personality gradually emerged, causing concern among many. According to the witness, from the very beginning, Nick frequently spoke about his parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, with a mixture of hatred and confusion. He once exclaimed that his father's fame was too great, making him feel pressured. "I constantly compared to others, and always living in his father's shadow." It seemed that nothing Nick did was enough to escape that judgment, and this frustration was building up in his mind. Meanwhile, Rob and Michelle did everything they could to help their son through this difficult period. They invested not only financially, millions of dollars in intensive treatments, from yoga and personal therapy to massages and a private chef, but also in time and emotion. They were always directly involved in therapy sessions, closely monitoring their son's recovery, creating the best possible environment for Nick to feel loved and cared for completely. These efforts were truly different from many other families, where parents only hire nannies or participate indirectly. However, according to witnesses, Nick didn't truly appreciate everything his parents did for him. His stubbornness, love of freedom, and rebellious attitude led to frequent conflicts with those around him. At times, Nick even lost his temper and lunged at his roommate, raising his fists, forcing center staff to intervene. These violent behaviors, though momentary outbursts of anger, revealed a part of his long-standing psychological distress and stress, stemming from pressure regarding his reputation and feelings of powerlessness. Remarkably, despite Nick's frequent defiance, Rob and Michelle never gave up on him. They continued to care for, support, and nurture him wholeheartedly. Witness Danny, who shared a room with Nick, stated that Nick's parents were always involved in all therapy activities, even playing frisbee and participating in training sessions, ensuring Nick didn't feel abandoned or lonely. Their love never diminished, even though he challenged and refused to acknowledge its value. According to Danny, Nick's psychological pressures and resentment began to develop in his teenage years. He not only faced immense expectations from his parents, but also struggled with a lack of gratitude and inner rebellion. Hatred, resentment, and a lack of understanding of love fueled escalating conflicts, leading to the tragic events that followed. Nick Reiner's story is more than just about a struggling individual. It reflects a harsh reality. Even in the best possible conditions, an expensive rehabilitation center, devoted parental care, and opportunities for recovery, without appreciating and understanding the value of love, psychological wounds can remain deep and lasting. These experiences shaped Nick for years afterward, influencing his decisions, behavior, and relationships as an adult. Nick Reiner's story is a powerful reminder of the strength of gratitude, the devastating consequences of neglecting love and support, and a testament to how, sometimes, teenage traumas can profoundly impact a person's life and choices for years to come. Now, we'll be discussing new details surrounding Nick Reiner with Maureen O'Connell, former FBI agent and host of the podcast Best Case, Worst Case. Moran has followed the case from the beginning and shares insightful information, particularly about Nick's time at a rehabilitation center in Malibu, California, when he was just 15 years old. One of the key witnesses is Danny, who shared a room with Nick at the center, and he recounts that as soon as he learned of Rob and Michelle Reiner's murders, Nick's image flashed vividly in his mind. Danny emphasizes that Nick wasn't the only case with warning signs, but those who knew the family all affirmed that Rob and Michelle were wonderful parents, wholeheartedly loving and caring for their children. They did everything they could to help Nick overcome his difficulties, but Nick's attitude revealed the potential danger he carried from his teenage years. Danny recalled the long, sleepless nights they spent sharing a room. Nick would often ramble on about his parents, uttering hateful words that, even at the young age of 15, would have shocked anyone. He expressed deep resentment at being compared to his father's fame, feeling never respected or appreciated. Despite Rob and Michelle's best efforts, Nick seemed unaware of or unappreciated of this. According to Danny, Nick was a stubborn, free-spirited boy who sometimes became violent. He had conflicts with his roommates to the point where staff had to intervene. These behaviors, along with his defiant attitude and lack of gratitude, were clear signs that Nick's psychological problems had begun to develop early, and that family conflicts, pressure for fame, and parental expectations had contributed to the strained situation. Rob and Michelle's efforts to help Nick recover were truly commendable. They not only invested money in expensive therapies, but also directly participated in therapy sessions, played frisbee, and took part in daily activities to create closeness and provide emotional support. They didn't want to miss any opportunity to help their son. So unlike many other families where parents might only be involved indirectly, Moran O'Connell emphasized that conversations with people like Danny were crucial for prosecutors. They helped shed light on long-standing grudges, warning signs, and the psychological context from his teenage years, thereby shaping how Nick perceived his behavior and responsibility in later events. Returning to interview witnesses from over 15 years ago might seem outdated, but for investigators, it was a vital step in understanding precisely the motives, timing, and warning signs Nick had exhibited. Another noteworthy detail Moran mentioned is that Nick may not have faced significant responsibility from a young age, unlike many adults who grew up in strict environments where responsibility was instilled early on. This may have affected his cognitive development, and emotional control skills, and empathy, leading to explosive behavior in his teenage years. Finally, Moran affirmed that all data and information from witnesses like Danny are being coordinated with the prosecution. Investigations are ongoing to shed light on what truly happened and to help build a complete picture of Nick Reiner's psychology, behavior, and environment, from his teenage years to the traumatic family events. Testimony from those who were close to Nick Reiner reveals that, from a very young age, his mental state began to show signs of abnormality. A roommate at a high-end rehabilitation center in Malibu recounted that all Nick cared about at that time was drugs, not just to escape his circumstances or the pressures around him, but also because he wanted to escape his own life. He longed for respect, like his parents, Rob and Michelle, who always strived to build the family's reputation and prestige. To some extent, Nick expected to be admired as well, but at 15, his ability to recognize and control his emotions was still limited. Resentment and dissatisfaction began to accumulate early, and marijuana use became a way to escape reality. The roommate said that every night Nick would ramble on about his parents, complaining about the pressure and the fame he felt he could never achieve. Despite Rob and Michelle spending millions of dollars to help him recover, directly participating in therapy sessions and providing emotional support, Nick showed no gratitude or appreciation. This attitude, combined with arrogance, stubbornness, and occasional outbursts of violence, and created a tense and dangerous environment even within the rehabilitation center. The violent acts witnessed by Danny, his roommate, were just the tip of the iceberg. Nick had conflicts with other roommates to the point where staff had to intervene, and he also expressed deep dissatisfaction with his parents' expectations. These experiences, though occurring at a very young age, are crucial pieces in understanding Nick's later motivations and psychology. Furthermore, Moran O'Connell emphasizes that the testimony of these witnesses is extremely important to the investigation. Information from the past helps prosecutors identify warning signs, psychological context, and long-standing resentments. It also sheds light on why violent behavior may have begun in adolescence, even before drug problems emerged. Moran also explained that in such high-end rehabilitation centers, handling violent behavior often happens internally. Staff may use sedation, isolation, or other control methods to ensure safety without necessarily notifying the police. This leads to a complex situation where families bear significant costs, yet warning signs may remain hidden or handled privately without being publicly disclosed. All this information reveals a disturbing reality. From a young age, Nick harbored deep-seated resentment and hatred, while his supportive environment failed to cultivate emotional control or develop gratitude and responsibility. These factors, combined with drugs and other pressures, contributed to a series of tragedies that followed. Rob and Michelle Reiner worked tirelessly to balance an extremely difficult situation, protecting their son, maintaining family privacy, and ensuring that any tense situations were managed without direct police intervention. They hired high-end rehabilitation centers and private security services with professional teams to monitor developments and handle any issues discreetly. However, despite their careful planning, a major question of moral and legal responsibility remained. If the level of violence exceeded acceptable limits, should the police be notified? According to basic rules, when someone is seriously injured or in danger of death, intervention by authorities is not only necessary but mandatory to protect human life. Nick's former roommate recounted that, from a very young age, Nick had frequently caused trouble and had violent outbursts of anger. There were times when he would throw tantrums, smashing stained glass windows in the chapel of the rehabilitation center, an act that, in an ideal world, should have been dealt with severely from the outset. Such outbursts of anger should have been managed with safe physical restraints or appropriate forms of discipline, creating clear consequences and helping him recognize his limits. However, the heartbreaking reality was that these consequences accounted for only about 14% of what should have been applied during Nick's maturation process, leading to missed warning signs and a deepening of resentment. Rob and Michelle, though heartbroken by their failures and limitations in controlling their son's behavior, remained determined to find difficult but necessary solutions. So they didn't choose the easy way, sending their son to comfortable but undisciplined centers, but instead opted for rigorous, challenging rehabilitation facilities, even in rugged remote areas, where Nick was forced to confront himself and learn to control his emotions. They didn't just spend money, they were directly involved. They showed up at therapy sessions, played with him, encouraged him every step of the way, observed and listened to him, always with the sole goal of helping Nick recover. This was a far greater effort than many other parents in similar circumstances who simply hired administrators or professionals to handle everything remotely. However, his roommate also pointed out a deeper problem: Nick's selfish attitude and resentment toward his parents' fame and success. While many would be grateful and happy to see their parents succeed, Nick focused solely on himself, wondering why the good things didn't come his way. This lack of gratitude, combined with long-simmering resentment and drug dependence, creates a complex and dangerous psychological picture that began to take shape in his teenage years. Nick Reiner's story is clear evidence that, No matter how wealthy, dedicated, and determined a family may be, money, power, or luxury services cannot fully compensate for deficiencies in character education, responsibility training, and emotional control. Rob and Michelle did everything they could. They didn't give up. They didn't abandon their son. They always stood by him. But for Nick, it seems all their efforts were insufficient to prevent the violence and hatred that had been deeply ingrained in his mind since his teenage years. This story raises serious questions about the limits of parental effort, how to balance protecting a child with establishing necessary discipline. When does overprotection become a risk? And when do money or luxury services become meaningless in the face of deep psychological issues? For Nick, this is living proof that even selfless, dedicated care may not be enough to change a person who has already developed resentment and selfishness from an early age. Family meetings, parent-teacher weekends, putting aside work and personal life just to be with their son. All of these things show that Rob and Michelle gave Nick a level of care that not every parent can or is willing to give. Therefore, and looking back at the whole story, many people can't help but feel sad and conflicted. Was there ever a moment when Nick was truly grateful? Or did he always view everything through the lens of resentment and demanding? According to those who knew him well, Nick wasn't just angry, but also very skillful at manipulating others' emotions. He knew when to appear vulnerable, when to show remorse, and when to simply use bait to draw attention, pity, or concessions from those around him. This pattern repeated itself for years, to the point that those who witnessed it described Nick as someone who knew exactly what he was doing and what he was doing to achieve it. Nick often blamed his parents' reputation for the root of all his life's problems. However, outside observers argued that the root wasn't their reputation, but their attitude, a lack of gratitude, an inflated ego, and a constant feeling of deserving more than he deserved. His outbursts of anger, impulsive behavior, and self-satisfied displays gradually eroded patience and revealed a deeper personality issue. The big question is, would things have been different if Nick had faced harsher consequences earlier? Some argue that if he had suffered a more painful setback at a young age, if his misbehavior had been stopped with stricter discipline, things might have taken a different turn. Many experts still believe that establishing boundaries and discipline early on, especially during the formative years, is crucial. When those boundaries aren't clearly defined or are constantly bent due to special circumstances and affection, the consequences can last into adulthood. Nevertheless, it's undeniable that Rob and Michelle tried. They didn't abandon their son, nor did they completely entrust him to others. They were involved, present, and did everything they could to help Nick recover. But sometimes, parental effort and love are not enough to compensate for deeply ingrained psychological problems in a child. Nick's former roommate also expressed skepticism about the possibility of a defense based on mental illness. According to this person, Nick's hatred towards his parents wasn't a sudden outburst or the immediate effect of stimulants, but something that had been nurtured from a very young age. This raises a serious issue in a legal context. If the behavior is the result of a long process with clear awareness, then blaming it entirely on mental illness becomes unconvincing. Another question arises. Could Nick have manipulated the psychological experts? Those familiar with the field argue that, while Nick might have tried, the experts didn't rely on a single assessment. They observed over a long period, asking the same questions in different ways at different times to find inconsistencies and weaknesses in the testimony. This is how they distinguish between genuine disorder and faking behavior. And when the case goes to trial, it's highly likely that many witnesses will appear. People who interacted with Nick at different stages of his life will recount behaviors, outbursts of anger, instances of manipulation, and warning signs that were overlooked. These testimonies, when pieced together, will paint a complete picture, not just of one crime, but of a long process of choices, opportunities, and in boundaries that were not maintained. Rob and Michelle's longtime friends who witnessed the entire process from the beginning often describe it as the insightful thinking of adults observing everything around them with a clear eye. They saw a child, in this case, Nick, behaving in unpredictable ways from a young age, and it was difficult to know whether this habit would change as he grew older. The journeys home after parties, holidays, or everyday events all left their mark, and looking back, many wondered, did he ever learn gratitude or self-control? Or were these behaviors deeply ingrained and inherent? These adults, the friends, were also a valuable source of information for the prosecution. They witnessed and understood the context, but at the same time, if called as witnesses, they would also face questioning from the defense. This made the trials tense and compelling, as they would feature testimonies from multiple perspectives, from those who witnessed both everyday moments and underlying tensions. The Reiner family, over a long period, did everything they could to help Nick. They didn't give up, nor did they leave everything to experts or outside services. Rob and Michelle were always present, involved in every aspect of Nick's rehabilitation, from parent-teacher meetings and therapy sessions to ensuring their son received comprehensive care. They believed in an approach based on direct observation, listening to their children, and applying reasonable, practical solutions rather than theoretical ones. While many other wealthy parents might simply hire managers or leave their children at the facility with little involvement, Rob and Michelle always strived to be present, exerting a positive influence and ensuring every decision was geared towards Nick's best interests. It's noteworthy that the high-end rehabilitation centers Nick attended often had extremely high fees, reaching tens of thousands of dollars per month, along with services such as yoga, massage, and a private chef. It was a luxurious environment, but also challenging, and cost or amenities didn't always equate to effectiveness. The professionals there typically offered various programs and methods, but much depended on the attitude, cooperation, and gratitude of the participant. In Nick's case, the problem wasn't just the environment, but his stubborn attitude, feelings of resentment, and long-established manipulative habits. Nevertheless, observers noted that Rob and Michelle did everything within their power. They set boundaries, actively participated in the therapy process, and strived to ensure their son received the best possible care. But this story also serves as a reminder of limitations. Even with all the love, time, and resources, parents cannot always control or change the nature of a child who has nurtured resentment from an early age. Overall, Nick Reiner's story is not just about a crime, but also a portrait of a persistent family, observant friends, and complex support systems. It reveals the contradictions between expectations, capabilities, affection, and the practical limitations of parenting and education. As the trial unfolds, there will undoubtedly be more testimony from these witnesses, offering insightful perspectives on a long, complex, and challenging process. During Thanksgiving dinner at the Reiner family home, an anonymous guest witnessed a striking and disturbing scene. Nick, according to the account, displayed a complete lack of gratitude for anything around him. He exclaimed, "I'm certainly not grateful for this food, nor am I grateful for any freeloaders in my house. I'm just eager to finish renovating this house." This attitude to those present was not merely the impulsiveness of a teenager, but a manifestation of a self-righteous mentality, a kind of extreme arrogance. The guest described Nick as throwing a turkey leg onto his father's plate, an act of resentment and violence, as if to shatter all the joy, all the warmth, the grateful moments of the family. While everyone around him shared their gratitude, chatted happily, and enjoyed the family gathering, Nick seemed unable to fit in, unable to feel the shared happiness. Everything had to be broken, becoming the target of his deep-seated resentment and inner rebellion. This is just one of many documented stories. His former roommate, Danny, also shared about sleepless nights when Nick would incessantly talk about his parents, about how much he hated them, about the anger that had been building up inside him. These stories reveal a complex psychological picture. Nick had harbored resentment towards his parents for a long time, stemming from the fame and success he felt he couldn't match. It wasn't just momentary frustration, but Nick's behavior was accompanied by an astonishing level of preparation and calculation. He prepared a knife, planned his escape, walked to the Pier-eyed Hotel in Santa Monica to check in, and tried to wash away the evidence. At midnight, he even went out to the USC area to buy drugs, a place he frequented. All of these actions suggest he hadn't completely lost control. Conversely, he was very level-headed, aware of his actions, and knew how to avoid consequences. Another noteworthy aspect was Nick's attitude towards wealth and family care. Despite Rob and Michelle doing everything they could to help him, from taking him to luxurious rehabilitation centers, hiring private security, even attending parent-teacher meetings and therapy weekends, and to providing direct care and spending millions of dollars to support his recovery, Nick showed no gratitude. His roommate noticed he was self-centered, manipulating those around him to achieve his goals, and completely unappreciating his parents' sacrifices and efforts. Nick's arrogance and selfishness became even more apparent when considering his social interactions. While everyone else was enjoying dinner and expressing gratitude, Nick remained completely detached. He couldn't fit in, couldn't accept the warmth, affection, and joy of family, all of which only made him feel more deprived and fueled his hatred. His roommate Danny emphasized that these behaviors weren't just random reactions. Nick frequently displayed impulsiveness, anger, and a willingness to be aggressive, from physical altercations with other teenagers at the rehabilitation center to destructive behavior at home, such as throwing rocks and breaking windows. All of this pointed to a long-established behavioral pattern: rebellion, hatred, and ingratitude, coupled with a sense of entitlement. Even the luxurious rehabilitation centers Nick had stayed in didn't completely solve the problem. Despite yoga classes, massages, a private chef, and costs up to $60,000 a month, these measures couldn't change the fundamental nature of his attitude and behavior. Nick still harbors resentment, still seeks to manipulate others, and still doesn't appreciate his parents' efforts. Stories from Thanksgiving dinner, from his roommate, from close witnesses, all contribute to a psychologically conflicted and tense picture. Nick Reiner emerges as a teenager consumed by hatred, ungrateful, and self-righteous, believing he can do anything from petty vandalism to serious acts with devastating consequences. The upcoming court proceedings will undoubtedly reveal more details, testimonies, and other stories from those close to him, all contributing to a clearer picture of a conflicted individual caught between family expectations, personal power, and fateful decisions. So, I've come back and want to reiterate what I discussed with Maureen O'Connell, as well as what Dr. Drew said about the incredibly expensive rehabilitation centers Nick went through. I rewatched that video, and perhaps I was a little wrong about the numbers. But the important thing is that the content Dr. Drew shared is still extremely interesting and thought-provoking. In general, Nick is a very complex case. He suffers from several mental health issues, including signs of multiple personality disorder combined with addiction. He is a particularly difficult patient to treat, frequently relapses, and has tried many different methods. Therefore, rehabilitation centers sometimes have to refer him to third-level treatment courts or programs, where he is closely monitored by a team of specialists. What Dr. Drew emphasized was that, while these centers may be luxurious, well-equipped, staffed with numerous doctors, have expensive medical tests, and sky-high care costs, the reality is, high-quality addiction treatment doesn't necessarily have to be expensive. Paying tens of thousands of dollars a month doesn't guarantee better results. In Southern California, There are excellent programs for low and middle-income individuals supported by the community and costing significantly less, sometimes a fraction of what the ultra-luxury centers charge. The issue isn't that the expensive centers are exploiting their clients, but rather that parents, in cases like Reiner's family, want to ensure their children are in the best possible care. They think, if possible, let's send our children to a place with top-tier doctors, high costs but high quality, and everything is perfect. As a parent, I completely understand that feeling. You want the best possible care for your child no matter the cost. But Dr. Drew also emphasized a crucial point. Money doesn't always equate to results. An expensive center doesn't necessarily guarantee a better recovery. It depends on many other factors: the patient's motivation, the treatment methods, ongoing monitoring, and their environment. In Nick's case, despite the family's significant financial investment and dedicated efforts, the results were not as expected. This demonstrates that even enormous expenditures cannot change the fundamental nature of his deep-seated psychological and behavioral problems. Therefore, the story of these ultra-luxury rehabilitation centers isn't just about money. It's proof of a reality. Nothing can replace genuine care, patience, and the right approach to each individual. Reiner's family did everything they could, from attending meetings and weekend activities to directly caring for and monitoring Nick's treatment. But the outcome was still affected by factors money couldn't control: personality, resentment, and deeply ingrained selfishness. And that's why I want to emphasize, this story isn't just about Nick's crime, but about how families, rehabilitation centers, and the entire mental health system are trying to operate in extremely complex situations. It's a lesson that money, power, or fame can't replace a genuine understanding of people, their psychology, and their deep-seated trauma. Therefore, I will continue to closely follow this story, every development, to share with you the latest information and the most detailed analysis. Once again, thank you for supporting the channel, subscribing, commenting, and watching these videos. And if you want to continue receiving updates like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos.